Robert Mitchell wore his favorite baseball cap and flannel shirt when he walked into the First National Bank branch on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. At 52, he looked like a simple farmer from upstate New York who'd come to the city to handle some paperwork. Branch manager David Johnson looked him up and down with disdain, chuckling with his colleagues behind the counter. When Robert asked to check his account balance, David burst into sarcastic laughter and shouted across the office, "If you have balance, I'll pay double." The entire branch erupted in laughter, treating Robert like a broke nobody who didn't even have money for coffee. But what David didn't know was that the man in the baseball cap standing in front of him was Robert Mitchell, CEO and owner of 60% of First National Bank's shares. And when the truth came out, what happened next became legend throughout the American banking industry. Robert Mitchell parked his old Ford pickup truck in front of the First National Bank headquarters on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. It was a particularly hot September day, and he wore what he always wore when he wasn't attending formal meetings: simple jeans, a blue and white flannel shirt, and his inseparable baseball cap he'd bought years earlier at a county fair. At 52, Robert had built one of the largest financial empires in America, but he'd always maintained a simple appearance that reflected his humble origins. He was born in a small town in upstate New York, son of a dairy farmer and a schoolteacher. He'd studied economics while working the fields in summer and waiting tables at night, graduating summa cum laude from Columbia University. His rise in the financial world had been rapid but quiet. He'd started as an analyst at a small community bank, then moved to investments, created his own financial consulting firm, and finally acquired increasingly larger shares of First National Bank until becoming majority owner and CEO. But Robert had a particular characteristic: he hated formality and ostentation. He preferred dressing like an ordinary man, driving normal cars, eating at roadside diners rather than Michelin-starred restaurants. This simplicity helped him keep his feet on the ground and truly understand the needs of common people. That day, he'd come to the branch for a surprise visit. As CEO, Robert often made these unannounced visits to check how his employees treated customers, especially those who seemed less affluent. He believed the true character of a bank was revealed by how it treated its simplest customers, not by how it bowed to the wealthy. When he entered the branch, the air conditioning hit him like a cool caress. The environment was modern, all glass and steel, with white desks and LED panels displaying the bank's services. Behind the main counter were 4 employees, 3 women in their 30s wearing elegant business suits, and a man in his 40s in a dark blue suit who appeared to be the manager. Robert approached the main counter with a calm pace, removing his cap out of respect. The 4 people behind the counter noticed him immediately, and the man in the suit, whose nameplate identified him as David Johnson, branch manager, looked up from his computer with an expression that immediately betrayed his annoyance. David Johnson was 45 and had worked in banking for 20 years. He'd risen through the ranks thanks to a combination of technical competence and ability to flatter superiors, but had developed over time a disdainful attitude toward customers he didn't consider important. Seeing Robert with his simple clothes and baseball cap, he immediately categorized him as a low-value customer. David's 3 female colleagues, Sarah, Jessica, and Michelle, followed his lead. They were used to following the manager's attitude, and when they saw him assume that air of superiority, they did the same. They began exchanging glances and smirks, as if Robert's presence was cause for amusement. Robert stopped in front of the counter and smiled cordially, placing his cap on the white marble surface. David didn't get up from his chair, continuing to stare at his computer screen with ostentatious indifference. Several seconds of awkward silence passed before he looked up with a bored expression. Robert maintained his smile, accustomed to this type of attitude. Over the years, he'd learned that many people judged by first visual impact, and he was always curious to see how his employees behaved when they thought they were dealing with someone inferior. The atmosphere in the branch was tense. Other customers, dressed more formally, were being served promptly at other stations, while Robert remained standing in front of the main counter, patiently waiting for someone to acknowledge him. What no one in that branch knew was that they were about to experience a lesson in humility that would forever change their careers and, for some of them, their lives. David Johnson finally looked up from his computer, sizing up Robert from head to toe with an expression that didn't hide his contempt. His eyes lingered on the simple jeans, the flannel shirt, the baseball cap placed on the counter. This was the type of customer who, in his opinion, wasted precious time that could be dedicated to more profitable clients. David's colleagues had stopped their activities to observe the scene. Sarah, a 32-year-old blonde in a perfectly pressed black suit, exchanged an amused glance with Jessica, a brunette with fashionable glasses who couldn't contain a smirk. Michelle, the youngest of the group, seemed a bit uncomfortable, but followed the example of her senior colleagues. David leaned back in his leather chair, assuming an even more disdainful attitude. He'd handled thousands of customers over the years and thought he could immediately recognize who was worth treating with respect and who wasn't. The man in front of him, with his farmer clothes and humble air, clearly belonged to the second category. Robert continued waiting patiently, observing with growing interest the staff's behavior. As CEO, he'd always preached the importance of treating every customer with respect and professionalism, regardless of their appearance or apparent economic situation. He wanted to see if these principles were actually applied when they thought no one was watching them. David finally decided to speak, but did so without getting up from his chair and with a tone that oozed superiority and annoyance. Robert responded calmly, explaining that he simply wanted to check his checking account balance. He spoke with a gentle and measured tone, showing no reaction to the manager's hostile attitude. At those words, David exploded in sarcastic laughter that echoed throughout the branch. He turned to his colleagues with an amused expression, as if he'd just heard the most ridiculous joke of his life. He got up from his chair and approached the counter, slapping his hand on the marble to get everyone's attention. With a loud voice so everyone could hear, David shouted the phrase that would become legend. "If you have balance, I'll pay double." The entire branch erupted in laughter. The three female colleagues covered their mouths to keep from bursting out. Some customers at other stations turned around amused. Even the security guard at the entrance smiled and shook his head. Robert had become the laughingstock of the entire office. Sarah added her comment among the laughter, suggesting that maybe he'd confused the bank with a welfare office. Jessica piled on, saying he was probably looking for a place to exchange coins found on the street. Even Michelle, despite feeling a bit guilty, let herself be carried away by the general atmosphere of mockery. Robert remained impassive during this entire humiliating spectacle. He showed no sign of anger or embarrassment, continuing to maintain that gentle smile he'd had from the beginning. His eyes, however, were memorizing every face, every name on the identification badges, every word spoken. David, intoxicated by the success of his performance and the laughter of those present, decided to go further. He returned to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a dollar coin. With a theatrical gesture, he tossed it toward Robert, accompanying the gesture with a contemptuous comment about charity. The coin rolled across the marble counter, stopping right in front of Robert. The metallic sound resonated in the silence that had suddenly fallen over the branch. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the reaction of this apparently humble man who had just been publicly humiliated. Robert looked at the coin, then slowly raised his gaze toward David, with an expression that had changed imperceptibly. The smile was still there, but something different had appeared in his eyes. Not anger, not humiliation, but a cold and calculated determination. What David and his colleagues didn't know was that they were about to discover how costly it can be to humiliate the wrong person. Robert looked at the dollar coin rolling on the marble counter, then slowly raised his gaze toward David Johnson. The gentle smile was still on his face, but something in his eyes had changed. With calm and measured gestures, he pulled out a small, laminated document from his wallet and placed it delicately on the counter. It was a corporate identification badge with the inscription, "Robert Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer, First National Bank." David approached curiously, thinking it was some document from the unemployment office. But when he read that inscription, blood froze in his veins. The man he had just humiliated in front of the entire branch was the owner and CEO of the bank. David's legs began to tremble. His face color went from normal to deathly pale in seconds. Cold sweat began to dampen his forehead. Behind him, the three female colleagues stared at that badge with expressions of pure terror. Robert took back the badge and put it in his wallet with the same calm. The atmosphere in the branch had completely changed. Customers who had been laughing now stared at him with respect mixed with embarrassment. The security guard had stiffened to attention. All employees had stopped working. David literally fell to his knees behind the counter, his hands trembling as he tried to access the computer. When he finally managed to enter Robert's account code, what appeared on the screen almost made him faint. $47.3 million plus connections to other accounts and investments reaching astronomical figures. Robert observed everyone's reactions without betraying any emotion. Then he asked David to print the account statement. When the paper came out, David handed it to him with reverence, as if he were handling a sacred relic. Robert carefully folded the account statement and put it in his pocket. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
With natural authority that filled the entire branch, he explained that what had happened wasn't just rudeness, but a symptom of a bigger cultural problem. David couldn't meet his gaze, desperately searching for something to say to remedy the situation. Robert also addressed the three women, who stared at him with expressions of pure desperation. Instead of yelling or threatening dismissals, he pulled out his phone and called Thomas Anderson, the bank's regional director. Robert explained the situation and requested an immediate meeting with all Manhattan branch managers. When he hung up, the entire branch was in absolute silence. He explained that the problem wasn't just David's, but the whole team that had participated in the humiliation. The three women found the courage to apologize, admitting their mistakes. Robert listened without interrupting, then explained that apologies were only a first step. He made an unexpected announcement. He wouldn't fire anyone immediately, but everyone would participate in an intensive customer service training program. David couldn't believe he was receiving a second chance instead of termination. Robert added that this experience would become a case study for the entire bank, as an example of what never to do. Before leaving, Robert took back his baseball cap and said that a person's true wealth is measured by how they treat others, especially those they consider inferior. As he headed toward the exit, the entire branch remained silent, aware they had witnessed a leadership lesson they would never forget. 3 months after the incident, the Fifth Avenue branch had become unrecognizable. Not in physical appearance, which remained the same elegant glass and steel environment, but in atmosphere and how customers were treated. The story of Robert Mitchell and his baseball cap had become legend throughout First National Bank. David Johnson had undergone a radical transformation. The arrogant and contemptuous man from 3 months earlier had disappeared, replaced by an attentive, respectful manager genuinely interested in every customer's well-being. He had participated in countless training courses, empathy seminars, and interpersonal relationship workshops. The retraining program imposed by Robert had been intense but illuminating. David had to work for a week as a regular customer in different branches, experiencing firsthand how it felt to be treated badly or with indifference. It was an experience that opened his eyes to the reality many customers faced daily. Sarah, Jessica, and Michelle had followed the same path. All three had learned that respect isn't a privilege to grant only to those who seem important. but a fundamental right of every human being. Michelle, in particular, had become an example for the entire bank. Her natural empathy, once freed from pressure to follow bad examples, had made her the most appreciated employee by customers. Robert continued his surprise visits, but now no longer needed to disguise himself or hide his identity. He had established a direct feedback system with customers and created an environment where employees felt valued for their authentic service, not their ability to flatter superiors. One December morning, Robert received a call from David. His voice trembled with emotion as he recounted something that had just happened. An elderly man dressed very modestly had entered the branch, with a worn jacket and scuffed shoes. He was George Wilson, a 76-year-old retiree living on minimum pension who needed to open a small account. 3 months earlier, David would probably have treated George with the same arrogance shown to Robert. Instead, that morning he had welcomed George with sincere respect, spent time explaining all available services, and even personally accompanied the elderly man to complete the paperwork. The biggest surprise came when George, moved by the treatment received, revealed he was the father of one of America's major real estate entrepreneurs. The son, learning of the exceptional service his father received, had decided to transfer all company accounts to First National Bank. It was a $15 million deal. Robert smiled, hearing David's story. He wasn't surprised. He'd always known that treating all customers well was not only the morally right thing to do, but also the smartest business strategy. The transformation of the Fifth Avenue branch had become a model for all other bank locations. Robert had decided to extend the training program to all personnel, creating a corporate culture based on respect, empathy, and authentic service. Results had been extraordinary. Customer satisfaction increased 40%, complaints decreased 80%, and positive word of mouth led to a 25% increase in new accounts opened. But most importantly, employees were happier and more motivated, creating a virtuous circle that benefited everyone. 1 year after the baseball cap incident, Robert Mitchell sat in his office on the 20th floor of First National Bank's skyscraper, looking at quarterly reports showing extraordinary results. But what made him proudest weren't the financial numbers, however excellent, but the hundreds of thank you letters from customers he'd received in recent months. The respect revolution, as the media had nicknamed the bank's transformation, had become a case study in economics and management universities across America. International business schools invited Robert to give conferences on how a single humiliating experience had become the catalyst for unprecedented cultural change in the banking sector. David Johnson had been promoted to Regional Coordinator for Customer Service, a role created specifically for him in recognition of his personal and professional transformation. Now he traveled across America, training other branch managers and sharing his experience. He had become one of the most credible ambassadors of the new corporate philosophy. The Fifth Avenue branch had become the most visited location by international delegations wanting to study the New York model of banking service. Sarah had been promoted to assistant manager, Jessica headed the personnel training department, and Michelle had become responsible for the new customer welcome program. Robert had implemented the baseball cap protocol. Every month, executives and managers had to make surprise visits to branches dressed as ordinary people to verify how apparently less important customers were treated. Those who didn't pass this test had to follow an intensive retraining program. Results had exceeded all expectations. First National Bank had risen from 14th to 2nd place in the national ranking for customer satisfaction. The number of new accounts opened had increased 60%, but most importantly, the type of clientele had changed. Not just wealthy individuals and companies, but normal families, retirees, young people at their first job, immigrants who previously felt discriminated against. Robert had received the CEO of the Year award from the New York Chamber of Commerce, but had decided to symbolically share it with David and the entire Fifth Avenue branch team. During the award ceremony, he told the story of that September day once again, emphasizing how sometimes the most important lessons come from the most humiliating situations. The story had gained international resonance. Harvard Business Review had published a case study titled "The Baseball Cap Revolution: How Humility Transformed a Bank." And Robert had been invited to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos about the importance of humility in corporate leadership. But the most significant impact had been on the daily lives of thousands of people. Elderly people who previously felt intimidated by banks now entered with confidence. Immigrants struggling with bureaucracy received patient and respectful assistance. Young people starting out were guided with understanding instead of being treated with condescension. George Wilson, the elderly retiree whose story had moved Robert, had become a sort of branch mascot. Every week he came to visit David for coffee, and to tell how he finally felt treated with the dignity he deserved. His son had kept his promise to transfer all his business to the bank, and had convinced other entrepreneurs to do the same. On a warm September day, exactly 1 year after the original incident, Robert decided to make another visit to the Fifth Avenue branch. This time he wasn't disguised, nor did he want to test anyone. He simply wanted to see with his own eyes how the new culture they had created together was working. When he entered, dressed in his usual simplicity but without the baseball cap, he was welcomed with sincere smiles from all the staff. But what struck him most was the general atmosphere. Customers of every age and social background were served with the same attention and respect. David saw him enter and went to meet him, no longer with the terror from a year ago, but with the warmth of a friend and collaborator. He told him about the branch's latest successes, but most importantly, showed him a wall where they had displayed customer thank you letters. One of these letters particularly struck Robert. It was from a young single mother thanking the staff for helping her open her first checking account with patience and understanding, explaining every detail without making her feel ignorant. Robert stopped in front of that letter for a long time. Then he turned to David and said something neither of them would ever forget. The most precious thing about this whole story hadn't been the increased profits or awards received, but discovering that when you treat people with respect and dignity, you're not just improving their day, you're improving the world. David nodded, thinking about how much he had changed, not only professionally but also as a person. He had learned that true leadership doesn't consist of dominating or humiliating, but in elevating others and creating an environment where everyone can give their best. That evening, Robert returned home with the awareness that the baseball cap incident had been one of the best things that could happen to his bank. Sometimes it takes a moment of humiliation to remind everyone of the importance of humility, respect, and human dignity. And while looking at New York's lights from his apartment window, Robert smiled, thinking that the next day he would wear his baseball cap again for another surprise visit. Because the respect revolution had just begun. Like if you believe respect is everyone's right, not a privilege for the few, comment which lesson from the story struck you most. Share to inspire those who believe in the importance of treating every person with dignity. Subscribe for more stories of authentic leadership and personal growth. Sometimes clothes don't make the man, but character makes the person. Sometimes it takes a moment of humiliation to learn humility. And sometimes the most important lessons come when you least expect them. Because a person's true wealth is measured by how they treat those they think can give them nothing in return.